Okay, so with that, having defined species, and there's more to it than that even. Because we said the oldest way of defining species was what? Just how they look. Yeah, it was all based on appearances. And then we started to think about it in terms of, whether or not they could breed. And now we also think about it in terms of shared DNA. So this is a horse. When you mate a horse with a horse, guess what you get? A horse. A horse is a horse, of course, of course. You don't even know what that means. You get a horse. Now, if you breed a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. If you breed a horse and a donkey, you get a mule or a hinny, depending on which parent is which. If you breed two mules, you get nothing. Mules are not fertile. Okay? So there are some weird exceptions to this which sort of challenge the species notion, and we'll talk more about those as we get into ecology. But for the most part, if you breed two species, they're closely related, what they produce is sterile offspring, a sterile hybrid. So where do we see these sterile hybrids? Because we do see them. We create them. So humans have been breeding mules for a long time. And in looking for images of mules, I found a few farms that advertise that that's kind of what they do. They sell mules. So they keep horses, they keep donkeys, they breed them. And what you get, so there's this thing, do you remember him talking about in the video yesterday, hybrid advantage? Sometimes the hybrid is better than either species that went into making it. So it's got some advantages. With mules, you get a huge animal. It's the size of a horse, but it's got donkey strength. Donkeys are actually stronger than horses, sort of on a pound-for-pound basis. They're tough little animals, but they're little. You've encountered donkeys?
Yeah, my aunt, she has like a farm and everything.
Okay.
And she takes like in the meat there, what they call it, not needed, but the
Like rescue animals?
Yeah.
Okay.
Rescue animals and curves,
Yeah.
and everything. So,
And she's had some donkeys?
yeah, she.
Okay. Yeah, donkeys are tough little animals. They're cool. I like donkeys. They're neat little animals. But when you breed one with a horse, what you get is this animal that's got the size of a horse and the strength of a donkey, and they're fantastic work animals. A lot of times when you see images of a draft animal pulling a plow, if it's not a draft horse, it's probably a mule, because mules are fantastic workers. So where else do they happen? What's called an open zoo, if you've ever been to some place like Pymatuning Deer Park or something like that, where they have animals that aren't only with their own species, you will have matings of lions and tigers. Now, if a tiger walked into a group of lions in the wild, in any place where the ranges overlap, they'd be killed. These don't happen in the wild. There are territorial concerns, but in a zoo, or in a situation where you have people who are raising exotic animals, it does happen. And they're kind of a novelty thing. And I haven't watched Napoleon Dynamite. I did not know that there is some obsession with ligers in the movie. Maybe I'll force myself to watch it. The other one is controlled breeding for very good reasons. Does anybody here fish? Okay. You like walleye? Walleye are pretty good. Do you know what a sauger is?
Oh, I had one the other day.
Did you? Okay. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and I worked for them right out of college. Like I said, squeezing fish for eggs and sperm. They make a cross called a saugai. And they take eggs from a bunch of walleye. Remember how I said we would collect all these walleye, you stick their nose in your armpit, you hold their tail, you squeeze their belly, all the eggs pour out into a bucket. Well, you collect all those eggs from female walleye, but then instead of getting a male walleye and putting his sperm in the bucket, you get a sauger. And you put his sperm in the bucket. And you stir it all up and you send it off to the hatchery. And the saugeye that comes back has got the size of a walleye. Yeah, they've got a whole page on it. Because walleye are a bigger, meatier fish. But saugers, I guess, are supposed to be like real good fighters. They're a real challenging fish, but they're little. And anglers want a big, meaty fish. So saugeyes kind of have the build of a walleye, but they have the fight of a sauger. So they also do this with northern pike and muskie. They make what's called a tiger muskie. And tiger muskies actually do occur in the wild. That's one of the species that do occur in the wild occasionally. Up north, so pike are a way northern species. You find much more pike in like Canada. You don't find them down here as much. Walleye you find down here. There's a point where their ranges overlap. And in that area where you can find both pike and muskie, you will occasionally get tiger muskie that occur in the wild. They're not fertile. So you don't find self-reproducing populations of tiger muskie. And again, people really like tiger muskie for some reason. I guess they can get bigger than either of the parent species. How big? Who here has ever seen a muskie up close and personal? Okay, how big do they get? Hold out your arms. Yeah, exactly. Huge. And tiger muskie apparently usually go over 50 inches. They're enormous fish. They are gigantic. Okay, but why don't hybrids usually happen in the wild? And we said tiger muskie, that does sometimes happen. And muskie, like a lot of fish, he makes a nest, she puts her eggs in it, he squirts his sperm on top. It's not flowers and candles and romance here, folks. With muskie and pike, you got a nest there. They don't have to ever interact. They don't have to ever see one another. And so in species where you don't have that kind of close interaction, it's more likely that you can get hybridization to occur. Like I said, if a tiger walks into a group of lions, it's going to be killed. We'll talk when we get into ecology stuff. We'll talk a little bit about coyotes and wolves and how they behave in the wild and where there has been some hybridization. Yes, sir?
How we all got like the animals and we never finished that.
What? Okay, so why don't hybrids usually happen in the wild? Because species are isolated. What does it mean if you're isolated? What does it mean if I isolate you? I put you in isolation. You don't see anybody. We send you off to the special room. They don't have a special room anymore. When I was a kid, they had a special room. It's like a closet under the stairs like Harry Potter lived in. So species are isolated from one another, and that can happen in a variety of ways. They can't reproduce together. Okay? So we see isolation between species, Gesundheit. Before we form new species, that's how we end up forming new species. But we also see isolation once species are established. So if we think back to the clipbirds. Okay, remember the clipbirds activity that we did? We had those clipbirds on an island, and suddenly some enormous mountain range grew up in the middle of the island. And the clipbirds on the east side of the island couldn't get to the west side of the island, and vice versa. They had been all one population. They were all one species. They were all capable of interbreeding on that entire island. But once they got isolated, they were now two populations. And this is usually how the process that we call speciation starts. Let me select this. I'll write that word, speciation. what does it mean when you hear Asian? I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. I can't. It usually means the process of doing something. So speciation is the process of forming a new species. Okay, speciation is the process of forming a new species. And that's usually started off by some kind of isolation. So in the case of the clipbirds, we had that island that got divided in half. They had been one population. Suddenly they're two different populations. And that's where you start to see things really diverge. To diverge means to split apart. So each population in clipbird started to change to fit their environment. And we said, what, on one end of the island, after a couple generations, we had all small bills. And on the other side of the island, after a couple generations, we had all big bills, right? If we went back there in 500 years, do you think that those birds would look even less alike than that? They might. Those birds might become very, very different. Two basic types of isolation. What is geography? What does geographic mean? Where are you out on the land? Yeah. So, we can talk about, in geography in elementary, you might have learned the state boundaries. You might have learned to identify the states on a map of the U.S. In geographic isolation, you end up with two populations that can't interbreed because they can't get to one another. So the clipbirds were an example of what kind of isolation? Geographic. So what I have here is a picture of two different types of squirrels. They're pretty cute, huh? And one of these is called they look real similar, don't they? They both have these, let's see if we can get a better picture. They both have these weird tufted ears. Like they have, their ears look like bunny ears. They've got these long bits of fur that come off the top of their ears. I have seen these squirrels up close and personal. Where I lived in Arizona, this was the squirrel we had. It's called an Abert's squirrel. And that doesn't matter for you, but they're called an Abert's squirrel. And they look an awful lot like, whoops, I'm spelling that wrong, the Kaibab squirrel. Also, the name does not matter, but it's just nice to name things. They look really similar. So they have similar what? What's the word we use to talk about appearances? More. We said the earliest systems for classifying species were based on morphology. Morphology. Okay, so these two are morphologically similar. They look alike. They look alike. You are all morphologically similar. You all have 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth, fur on the top. Yeah, these two species are morphologically similar. Now here's the rub. Does anybody know what this is? It's a big canyon.
Grand Canyon.
It's the Grand Canyon, yeah. Well, the Kaibab squirrel lives on the north side of the Grand Canyon. The Abert squirrel lives south of the Grand Canyon. If you go south of the Grand Canyon, the only kind of squirrel you're going to see is an Abert squirrel, this guy. If you go north of the Grand Canyon, the only kind of squirrel you're going to see is the Kaibab squirrel, this guy. So they look really similar. So based on morphological similarities, we would think, oh, these two are probably related. Well, when you sequence their DNA, guess what you find? Yeah, they share a lot of DNA. And the divergence in their DNA dates to the point in geologic and geographic history where those populations could not have interbred. So they have a common ancestor. If we did a what kind of tree? Phylogenetic tree. They share a common ancestor. They share a lot of characteristics. They would be a little branch like this off other squirrels. They're closely related, but they were geographically isolated. Okay. The other kind of isolation that we usually see, and this should look familiar to you. Does this look familiar to anybody? You drew it. Okay. Is what we call reproductive isolation. So reproductive isolation means they're living side by side. There is no physical boundary that they can't meet up and say, hello. But there's some reason they can't reproduce together. There's some kind of biological roadblock. And we're not going to get into the technical details, but this can take, I mean, pre-zygotic, post-zygotic, we're not getting into that. If, for instance, the mating dance that one particular bird does scares the bejabbers out of another kind of bird, they're not going to mate together. If they mate at different times, and this is the graph that you drew, the wood frogs mate early, the leopard frogs mate late. They're probably not going to reproduce together. Their mating cycles are off. If they have different numbers of chromosomes, so even if they manage to get their eggs and sperm together, they don't form an embryo. You know, this species sperm can't fertilize this species egg. They're not going to reproduce together. So reproductive isolation means they're side by side, they're neighbors, they can talk, they could exchange eggs and sperm, but for some reason they don't. There's some biological reason that they don't do that. Okay. So once we get some amount of isolation, either usually it starts off as geographic isolation, sometimes reproductive, but usually geographic, and we get some kind of disruptive selection, working on variation within the species. This is where we can get to a point where we've got things that are different enough that we start to look at them and go, oh yeah, I think those are different species. And forming a new species typically does take quite a while. The big debate biologically, it used to be a debate. It used to be well, do you believe it happens this way or do you think it happens this way? And what we now know is that the evidence, because remember in science we're all about evidence, the evidence shows that it happens both ways. So the big difference, like I said, it used to be a debate, is between what's called gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. And these are on your vocabulary sheet. So gradualism, what does it mean if something happens gradually? Slowly. It happens so slowly you might not even notice. Your hair growing. Does your hair look different from one day to the next? No. But over the course of 6 months, if you don't get a haircut, you start to notice that your hair is longer. That's something that happens very, very gradually. The idea in gradualism is that you have little tiny changes every generation, and that you might not even see a difference from one generation to the next. But then suddenly if you compare this one to this one, they look really different. And you drew a picture like this from your book, too. So this should be familiar to you. And you know what? Those illustrations you did actually should be part of your study guide. You drew them, you wrote the words. That's something that you should use as part of your study guide, especially if you're a really visual learner. So gradualism means change happens gradually. punctuated equilibrium. What does punctuated mean? What is punctuation in English? Like periods and exclamation points and things that end a sentence. Okay. What does equilibrium mean? Equal, staying the same. We've talked about equilibrium in terms of genetic equilibrium. So punctuated equilibrium is this idea that nothing changes, nothing changes, nothing changes, then all of a sudden, boom, we put in an exclamation point. And there's a really rapid change. So we said your hair growing is a very gradual process. If you get your hair colored, so if I go out and I dye my hair bright purple when I come into school tomorrow, my hair's been this color for a really long time, then pow! That'd wake you all up, wouldn't it? Pow! My hair's a different color. Maybe I should do that to emphasize punctuated equilibrium. You can do it. You can do it. I'm shocked. It doesn't have to be a surprise. Nothing happens, then pow, something happens. It doesn't have to be a surprise. I bet you'd still be surprised if I walked in here with bright purple hair. So yeah, punctuated equilibrium. Nothing happens, and then boom, it all happens at once. So you get rapid change. Okay, that is it for this chapter. That is it. What I'm going to do is give you the rest of the time here to make sure that you've got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed on the vocabulary sheets. Here's the other thing I'm going to tell you. When I check those tomorrow, so when I checked them the first time, okay, you were missing some stuff in the first column, or your stuff in the second column wasn't actually a dictionary definition, it was kind of BS. It was not, you like kind of approximated. Tomorrow when I check it, if it is not a perfect dictionary definition in that second column, you're not getting any credit for it. So you've got right now to go back, finish up the first column if you missed some stuff, make that second column perfect, and use your notes, the notes that you've been taking, use the videos online, whatever other resources you need to finish that third column. So tomorrow I'm going to do a final check on these, and you'll have a study guide tomorrow that will be due on Monday, and that's it. Questions, comments, or concerns?